This is Interactions of Society in the Environment Seminar Series, ISESS. To be a member of Interactions of Society in the Environment Seminar Series, you have to be able to remember the acronym, which is ISIS, which is kind of interesting now. I've made that, I can make that joke about once a year, by one time this year. But anyway, thanks for coming down on this kind of cold, wintry day, at least here in Fort Collins. We've got an interesting bit of information for you. And before I kind of turn this over for a couple of minutes to Sarah Molina, who is the education specialist and works at the Office of Education and Outreach with the National Parks Service here in Fort Collins, I wanted to just go back a little bit to talk about how these projects came to be. And it kind of started quietly with a grad student of ours by the name of Christy Burnett about 3 years ago. She wanted to do some research on natural resources, and she was very interested in the white-nosed bat syndrome. And yeah, I'd never even heard of something like that, but she wanted to do some research on that. So she went out and did some focus groups and came up with some ideas and came up with a report for the National Park Service, and it was quite well received. And from there, Kirsten Leong, who's now with NOAA in Hawaii, which was a good move for her at this point if you look at the weather outside. She moved recently. And also bringing in Sarah Molina. She was interested in, we were at Black Bottle Brewery here in Fort Collins having a beer at one point, and she said, you know, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's happening with the media. And I said, I know, right? You know, it really is. And she said, you know, maybe you guys could do some research that would look at that and to understand both what's happening in that mediated communication and how it's integrated with what we're doing in our Park Service mission. You know, so that's how that all started. So from there, I'll just kind of keep going here, Sarah, just for a second. From there, we came up with this idea for a project in which, with the National Park Service celebrating its 100th year this year in 2016, they had launched as you'll hear, they had launched a campaign on social media, on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, trying to get people to participate, you know, and get excited about the Park Service and the centennial. And so we came up with this idea to maybe compare the way the National Park Service was communicating with the way citizens were communicating and to see what we could find. So we'll be talking about that as well. And then from there, Sarah, do you want to come up and talk a little bit more about or maybe I could move that way, just hand you this mic. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sarah Molina. I work for the National Park Service in the Natural Resource Stewardship and Science Directorate, kind of on the other end of town. And like Joe said, I won't repeat the history there, but one of the other projects that we had started working on after the Find Your Park campaign, Kirsten Leong and I had been sitting around, and every couple of weeks we're like, you know what, we're going to get together and talk about things that make sense between the work that she does in human dimensions and natural resources and mine in communication. And my master's degree is from CSU in human dimensions and communication, or human dimensions and natural resources. And we kind of came around to this, we're like, you know, the most awesome project we could come up with would be based in human dimensions and applied in a communication realm. Kind of thinking about many papers that I've read kind of in my graduate work that looked at how people were thinking about natural resources and saying, you know, here's what we can do to apply it to management. And then you should do communication too. And that was like the last, you know, sort of the last sentence in that paper. And we're thinking, let's put that up front and center, particularly when it comes to human-wildlife interactions. We need to think about what we can do with communication first as one of our approaches to managing human-wildlife interactions, because so much of that behavior is dependent on the people that are coming to parks. And we're going to reach them through our education and outreach. And so that was another one of the projects that we were able to put together working with Joe and then Katie Abrams, who is not here today. And that'll be another project that we are going to... Well, Katie Abrams, but then also Ashley, that was related to, I met Ashley at Christie's Burnett's thesis defense. And I remember we were just sort of chatting, and Ashley was talking about what she does with science communication, and helping students work on real projects around science communication. I was sitting there thinking, wow, we have report after report after report that could be fodder for decades of science communication. And that was sort of my initial thought, and connected actually with Jeff Albright, who works on our natural resource condition assessment. So that was sort of another bend of all these little discussions that came through. Hey, let's have a beer. Hey, let's meet regularly for coffee and just see where our where we can find common ground. I think there have been some great projects that are coming out of those sort of informal discussions.
No, that'll do it. And what I'll do now is explain Katie Abramson. I'm really sorry she couldn't be here. She's very sick. She's going to be okay, but it's just stuff that's going around. And so I guess I'll just tell you a little bit about her, and then we'll hear from Ashley Anderson and then my project. So Katie Abrams is an assistant professor in my department in journalism and media communication at CSU. She has expertise in the area at the intersection of strategic communication and food system issues. Specifically, she examines how people make use of and participate in debates about food communication effects and things like that in systems. So that's really what she focused on. But she also is interested in environmental communication. And in this project, she was pulled in. I'm just reading her description here. I received this about an hour ago. So it entails message design and observational research in 3 to 5 parks across the United States. The overall goal is to create a communication framework for parks to use for messages aimed at alleviating human-wildlife interaction. Her work specifically is a 2-part study that will look at motivations for individuals approaching or getting too close to wildlife, which we know is a huge problem right now. And it will pretest some message design based on these motivations and risk communication theory. And she's really proposing a connection between individuals' risk perceptions and their online identity. I just want to show you, she's got a lot of great slides here, and we'll bring her back in the spring, but just to kind of look at a couple of things that kind of set the context for what she's doing. First of all, in the news, from digital trends, peacocks die from shock after being picked up for photos and their feathers are plucked. Bison attacks woman who's trying to take a selfie with it in Yellowstone Park. That's from CNN. We're begging you, stop taking selfies with wild animals. That's from Travel and Leisure. Woman roughly dragged swan out of water by the wing for a selfie. Struggling with a shark, man attacked by a bison, rattlesnake selfie. When humans fueled by selfie culture imperil wildlife, that in the New York Times. Tourists disturb nesting sea turtles to take selfies on a Costa Rican beach. And this is kind of, I mean, people have always interacted with wildlife inappropriately, but we're seeing a level that we've never seen before. I see people kind of shaking their heads who work with wildlife and people. And this is something that Katie really wants to examine. So the overview, like I said, she's looking at technology effects, social networking sites, applications, what's the role of camera phones and beyond. I'm kind of interested in things like GoPros, drones, flying drones and drones on the ground and things like that. Identity and self, the blurring between online and offline selves, is that prompting people to get too close? Is it changing people's risk perceptions? What does that mean for the approaches people are making to wildlife and national parks? And it really is a 2-part study. The second part, which I don't think I mentioned much, was once she understands that first part, the relationship between online identity maintenance and risk perceptions, then she wants to do some best practices kind of research. What are some good, messages that would change behaviors in terms of risk? And so that's what Katie's working on. And that's an image of the baby bison that had to be euthanized after people tried to sort of, quote, rescue the baby bison. Okay. So unfortunately, she couldn't be here, but we will have her come back as soon as possible. I'm going to set this down for a second. Yeah. This is Sarah Molina.
I just wanted to add kind of in the way that we were thinking about this project, there, like Joe pointed out, there are a couple pieces to it. In the first part, we were thinking about as a way to kind of diagnose the problem, we have been working with Ashley Gramza in, I think, conservation biology at CSU and as a part of this group. So it was the project was a collaboration between journalism and mass communication and human dimensions and natural resources. And part of the human dimension aspect of it, Ashley has gone to a number of parks and applied observation protocol, basically. So taking her wildlife background, she took that and kind of applied it to human behavior and went out and sat and watched people as they approached wildlife, kind of looked at the site and said, where are the signs, what sort of information is being put out there, how are these interactions being discussed in both printed materials and then in interactions with rangers, and just from an observational standpoint only, so she could just look and see how these interactions were occurring, and bringing that back to get a better assessment of where are the specific problems that are happening, rather than a very broad approach to saying, you know, keep wildlife wild. Can we go in and pinpoint the exact behaviors that we're interested in the interaction that we're looking at, and try and target our messaging around those behaviors as opposed to the larger blanket approach. The other beauty of taking that observational approach is we're, in this context, for a very practical application, we're not asking people to go out and survey motivations. We're just and go through a whole process of getting approval through OMB to get a survey approved, which will be sort of an immediate practical shutdown for a lot of parks to go through. It would be just go through this observation protocol and look for these specific behaviors. And Katie will be able to take she'll go a little bit further with doing the message development and testing in a much more rigorous manner that we can then bring back in those contexts as well. So we're trying to find what is the most practical way that we can move forward with developing a research-based messaging campaign, but making sure that we aren't sort of throwing up roadblocks to having our parks look at the behaviors that are happening in a critical manner. So we're looking through this as a way of bringing those pieces together. And I'm really excited about how this project is coming along and bringing together different ways of looking at a human behavior problem in national parks.
Okay, so now we'll transition to our first speaker. I almost said our next speaker, and that is Dr. Ashley Anderson. She's an assistant professor in my department. Again, that's the Department of Journalism and Media Communication at CSU. Her research examines the role of communication and how people form opinions about and engage with scientific and environmental issues. Some of her recent work examines communication around extreme weather events. She's done quite a bit of publishing there, such as flooding and heat waves as it relates to opinion formation around climate change. She often studies these issues in the context of conversations that happen online, and this is something we really need to know more about today. For instance, she has investigated how the phenomenon of user-generated comments connected to news media play a role in the interpretation of news. So Ashley, why don't you come on up and you can talk about your research.
All right, thanks, Joe. So I'm going to talk about this project related to how park resource managers are using information sources coming out of the National Park Service. And so the overarching question we're examining today with all of these presentations is the role of communication in the preservation of natural resources and different resources within the parks. And so this project in particular looks at this question by analyzing how park resource managers are using the various scientific information sources that are produced by the Natural Resource Stewardship and Science Directorate. That is NRSS for short. And so before I get started talking about this project and some preliminary findings from it, I want to briefly acknowledge Holly Marlett is sitting in the audience with us. She's a PhD student in our department, in the Journalism and Media Communication Department, and also Jeff Albright, who I don't see is here, but he coordinates the Natural Resource Condition Assessment Program over at NRSS, and both Holly and Jeff have been heavily involved in the design and conduct of this research. All right, so I wanted to start off by talking about the Natural Resource Stewardship and Science Directorate materials, and these are really the sort of sources that we're, with this project, that we're interested in understanding how they're being used by managers, what kinds of things they're familiar with, and how they might be implemented in their day-to-day management strategies and long-term strategic planning initiatives, things like that. And so this is, I'll just briefly talk through these different information sources just to give you an idea of some of the kinds of things that NRSS produces. So there's the Natural Resource Condition Assessments, the NRCAs. So these provide park managers a sort of snapshot in time assessment on and a report on current conditions in their park. Maybe they provide critical data gaps, and they look at select conditions based on the individual parks. And yeah, and so those individual resources are selected on kind of a case-by-case basis. The Natural Resource Report Series is just a different reporting mechanism for natural resources. The examples of these kinds of reports might be inventory reports, monitoring reports, or species updates, species status reports. There are resource briefs, which are brief, often short materials that engage different natural resources at specific parks. IRMA, the Integrated Resource Management Applications Portal, is the National Park Service-wide repository for different types of information for all the different reports, publications, and data sets related to the natural and cultural resources in the parks. And then finally, the State of the Park reports provide visitors and the American public a snapshot of the status and trend in the condition of a park's priority resource and values. So this isn't a comprehensive list of everything that's available from the NRSS, but again, just to give you an idea of the range of reports, data stores available through the NRSS. So I joined forces with the NRSS to better understand how these information sources and scientific information sources are faring. And so we conducted in-depth interviews with 23 park managers. These were sampled across the seven of the MPS regions. These were conducted this fall, so we're just finishing them up. So, you know, what I'm presenting today is preliminary findings from sort of an initial review of those interviews. And the kinds of park managers that participated were, you know, they would primarily be referred to as sort of the chief of resource management in their park. That was probably the most common title for the managers that were interviewed. Some of them also specifically had cultural resources in their title. And then we also interviewed people who might be scientists for their parks, like a biologist or an ecologist. And that might be the case if a park is maybe smaller, doesn't have a dedicated resource manager, that kind of thing. And so this project focuses broadly on their information use, asking this question: how do resource managers engage with the NRSS information sources? And so we looked at questions like, you know, what kinds of NRSS information sources are they familiar with? Which ones do they find effective and useful? How do they access that information, and how do they implement it in the management of resources in their parks? So ideally, this research will eventually inform sort of the evaluation of the existing sources that NRSS provides, and hopefully the development of sort of better sources of information in the future, so that practical application. So I want to talk briefly through some of the broad themes that are starting to emerge from the data that we collected, and look at these different perspectives that the resource managers are giving us. So the first theme I identified here is sort of this prevalence of a lack of resources on the resource manager's part. And so primarily what that refers to is, not surprisingly, they lack time and they lack staff to do what they need to do. So that's kind of a key component in how they seek out and use information. So first, they need and want information to be really comprehensible without taking too much time to digest. Having information in the form of briefs is really important to them. And so the resource briefs are one of several NRSS materials that were identified quite a bit in the interviews. But they're also seeking out information that is really easy to access and available quickly. So one of the primary go-to sources of information was Google Scholar. And so in addition, the IRMA portal was widely mentioned. And so managers are pointing to the increasing scarcity of resources over time, with only growing needs for more information in an efficient manner. In addition to this, there appears to be kind of a data and information overload. So it's not just about identifying potentially relevant information for them, but also being able to find it, understand it, and use it in the practical management context. So the next theme that we identified is this issue-driven information seeking. So their information seeking is driven highly by their needs for information about specific resources and issues within their parks. So when they have management needs within their parks, they're finding and using resource information for those particular issues. Therefore, the source of information, like whether it be a type of report like an NRCA report, or the particular NPS division, the NPS Air Resources Division, or whether it's internal to National Park Service or external to National Park Service, none of that really matters. As long as it's not as important as knowing that they can rely on the source as providing accurate and relevant information about that particular issue under question. And so, questions of credibility of the information generated by NRSS weren't necessarily identified as a prominent issue or concern at present. And if the information is unavailable, they may also sort of seek out funding to collect the necessary data to address that particular issue management question. And so understandably, information sources by park managers are typically driven by pressing issues, questions, or other management information needs. So while managers generally appreciate background information and in-depth analyses that provide useful orientation materials for new park staff and to share with park partners, those materials sometimes aren't aligned with the immediate and specific information needs that they have. So the third theme here is the prominence of interpersonal contacts. And this is highly related to this theme of issue-driven information seeking. They rely on interpersonal contacts for obtaining the most relevant information efficiently. For instance, managers might call in experts at nearby partner agencies or universities when they need information about a specific issue. They also develop relationships with individuals within different divisions at the National Park Service, or with the inventory and monitoring network they might turn to with specific questions. And there may be some NPS regions where these relationships are easier to develop than others. If their park is big enough, managers may even have staff scientists with particular sets of expertise that they can turn to for the latest information on a resource issue. So park managers are developing trusted information sources, especially colleagues and partner scientists, so that they can find information and answers that they need from these trusted sources, and then they're sort of less inclined to spend their precious time on looking for additional information that may be out there. Then the next one is reliance on their own information collection and storage. So particularly for managers who have been with their parks for a number of years, they've likely developed their own information stores of data and peer-reviewed journal articles that they rely on for their management decisions. A manager might return to a single useful report repeatedly or maintain an entire bibliography of resources collected on their own. A few managers maintain databases that allow them to generate spreadsheets on demand. So this speaks to the institutional knowledge and context that a park manager develops over his or her career, and it helps them be efficient in sort of cutting to the chase, getting the information that they need. In generating these information sources, managers may turn to local resources, researchers from universities or other agencies like USGS, Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, for information already available from these sources, or also to collect new data. And then finally, there's this idea that the NRSS materials are really serving as an institutional memory. These materials are considered as useful background information on any given park for individuals unfamiliar with the current state of resources in the park. For instance, a manager might direct an external researcher from another agency or university or a new interpretive staff member without much technical experience to these sources of information for an increased understanding on the background of resources that are happening in the park. This is kind of an institutional memory that transcends the individual personnel dealing with the resources or specific resources that are under question in the management at the time. So that kind of concludes some of these preliminary findings that are emerging out of these interview materials and the data from the interviews. In the future, we plan to continue developing and solidifying these themes from these different interviews, and ultimately, hopefully this will help inform sort of, again, that practical application of hopefully the better development of NRSS materials in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, let's take a few questions.
Sure. Oh, yeah. So the question is about what kinds of information informally that they're turning to sort of outside of these NRSS materials, right? And so as I mentioned sort of closer to the beginning, Google Scholar was mentioned by almost all managers. So they have their own research tools that they're implementing through Google Scholar, maybe through a library if they have access to one. Several, have mentioned relationships they have with librarians, for instance. And so those, and then using that to develop their own, like bibliographic reference list, for instance. And then sort of alongside that, they're looking to, depending on the park, they might be looking to associated, researchers and scientists in other networks, right? So maybe they're surrounded by land that is controlled by the Bureau of Land Management, for instance. And so they will have, that sort of interpersonal network of contacts there, tapping into the data that they have and the scientific information that they are conducting to, make decisions within their park, which is right next door. So those are, a couple of examples of the kinds of things that they're doing. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Come back to some questions later. One thing I'll say before I introduce our topic is that what's interesting about our program, our department, is that we have such varied approaches theoretically and methodologically, and that's something we think that we can offer to something like the National Park Service. I think Ashley really has a strong, what you would call environmental communication focus, and that's something based in media effects research that goes back really to the early 20th century. And they've been developing this for years and years, and there's some really exciting work that's going on right now, and she's a part of that, which is really great. And they really have a strong sort of scientific methodological approach. And then if you look at Katie's work, she's, using Irving Goffman, of all people. So he's really talking about performance. He's a sociologist that people really have, a lot of different theorists across the board have drawn from. And that gives us another, another perspective. And then in my case, and in Emily's case, it's kind of like the Monty Python, and now for something completely different. We really, as you'll see here, we're social scientists. I consider myself to be a social scientist, but I also kind of pay attention to what's happening in the humanities. What are the philosophers doing? What are they doing in political science, especially on that qualitative side, with the interpretivists and things like that. So you'll see a sense of that in this research, because I believe that with the wicked problems that a lot of the natural resource agencies in particular are facing, we need a multitude of approaches to take these on. We all need to jump in and do what we can do. So I want to introduce Emily Johnson. She's a doctoral candidate in our program. And actually, what's interesting is she has studied haul videos, which, do you want to explain what those are a little bit?
So for my master's thesis, I looked at YouTube haul videos, which if you're not familiar, they are short 7 to 15 or so minute videos where a lot of times it's young women who go on and showcase their shopping spree purchases. So like a video, saying I went to Sephora and bought all these things, and then kind of explaining what they're going to do with them. So if you want, yes. And then my dissertation looked at Pinterest and how women who are planning their wedding use Pinterest as a tool. So I've conducted 20 interviews with different women ranging in age and kind of status in terms of, are they engaged in planning, or did they already get married and use Pinterest? So I just finished doing those interviews, and now I'm on to the analysis of them. So it's a little bit.
One more thing, and that is important because look what just happened in the last election. I will be spending a lot of time talking about political communication and changing all that because of what's been happening in our society based on online communication. So Emily's really one of those explorers who are out there, just trying to find those new trends, new patterns, and to map these out. So with that, I'm going to have you introduce this topic.
Okay. So we are going to talk to you today about the project that we're working on analyzing the Find Your Park campaign, which is part of the National Park Service's 100th year birthday celebration. And so I have a video that I want to show. So just to give you some background, it was a short 1-minute video, kind of a public service announcement from the National Park Service explaining what the Find Your Park campaign entails. So in short, it's a campaign that invites people everywhere to celebrate the 100 years of the National Park Service and discover their own personal connection to the parks. And so the campaign is directed towards millennials, especially because this group is really important for the Park Service to target, to get their involvement going to the parks, exploring, explaining what it is that they're experiencing there. So part of what we're doing is assessing. So part of what we're doing is seeing how effective is this campaign with reaching a millennial audience, and then also exploring, on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other platforms that the National Park Service is using, how do older generations respond to their content as well. So to give you a little background about the study goals, one of our main goals is to develop a research method using social media to compare citizen and National Park Service content. So Joe talked about this a little bit, but what we're doing is looking at the social media platforms that the National Park Service is using, which include Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and we're looking at what are citizens saying in response to the campaign regarding their experiences in the national parks, and then what is the National Park Service saying. So it's kind of a comparative analysis. And then the ultimate goal is to provide the National Park Service with some final recommendations for how it can most effectively produce messages resonating with today's public, focusing a little bit more specifically on millennials. So we just kind of wrapped up phase 1 of this study, and we are using actor network theory, narrative theory, and grounded theory to inform a lot of what we're doing. The samples that we used for phase 1, our units of analysis included Instagram and Facebook. So we sampled 60 posts from 60 citizen posts and 60 National Park Service posts from those two platforms. And then we used in Vivo qualitative software to do the following. So the first piece was analyzing these posts at a very granular level, which is what we mean by granular is very basic. So looking at the image and coding for exactly what we see within that image. So the next slide is an example of what this looks like. But coding at the very basic level for the image and the text. So the caption that's used in the Facebook post or the Instagram post, hashtags that are used with it, and then the image itself. From this coding process, we then went into NVivo and created a list of hierarchy codes, or nodes is specifically what they're called within NVivo. And we're doing this very granularly so that we're not missing any important themes. From there, we had a really massive list of different codes that emerged through this process. We took that list of codes and condensed it using constant comparison methodology, kind of looking at what's similar, what's different, what can we actually pull in together. And then we used the sunburst and tree map tools provided in NVivo to interpret our findings, which Joe is going to give you some visual examples of that. And then finally, we developed some narratives that are associated with themes present in these analyses. So this is an example of a Facebook post. And if I was coding this in NVivo, I would be coding for things like bear, tree, hashtags. Specifically within NVivo, we've created codes that really represent what are people saying in the hashtags. So this one says Great Smoky Mountains, National Park. Find Your Parks, we have like extensive lists of codes within NVivo where we pull these different hashtags in to speak to those codes. Things like leaves, tree, the fact that this post is reposted from the U.S. Interior, so we look at the actual logistics of the post to see, is it a repost, is it original to the user? So this is what we mean by this idea of granular coding, looking at the very basic elements of the post. And then, for this particular example, we titled this Experience Wildlife at National Parks. So it's a narrative of, you know, this person is saying it's important to go and experience wildlife at a national park. This is an image of the NVivo software, and what you can see here, it's probably kind of hard to see, but we have grandparent, parent, child, and grandchild nodes, which is what NVivo calls the different hierarchy levels for their coding. And so the overarching codes, or grandparent codes that we've created so far, include presentation of humans, presentation of place, nature, or physical experience, and presentation of post. And so within those three grandparent nodes, or codes, we've developed parent, child, and grandchild nodes, which are all associated with them. And that's kind of what we're using to piece together to communicate these narratives, which Joe's going to talk about a little bit more. But as you can see from this slide, this is just a snapshot of our codes, and this is just part of them. So it's a very extensive list that we're still working to condense and kind of make more sense from. And now I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
I can't play that video, but that's okay. What I can show you is one of the, what are we finding? This won't make a whole lot of sense to you. It kind of barely makes sense to us, but this is one of the visualizations that NVivo creates, which is really what we're trying to do, is to take, you know, these myriad codes and to sort of blow them apart and kind of put them back together essentially into something like this. This is called a sunburst code. And so what you can do when you look at something like this is, you know, this inner donut here represents presentation of place, of nature, of physical experience, and then that sort of blue slice there is presentation of humans. And then what it does, and this is what I was hoping to show you on the video, was that as you click on these donuts out here, then you can kind of open them up, and you can see how are those created. How are people, when they want to talk about the presentation of humans, what are they mostly presenting in their posts? How does that then compare from the citizen side to the NPS side? Okay. Now, what we just saw, that's the citizen side for both Facebook and Instagram. And now this is the NPS side for Facebook and Instagram. When you look at it, you should think, wow, that looks really the same. And that just about drove us nuts, because it really does, because we're seeing massive similarity. And that really bothered us. We were really hoping that we would see just this massive smoking howitzer that would show differences, that we could go to the National Park Service and say, look, you're doing something that's completely different in your communications than the citizens. So at first we were kind of concerned about something like this. But then I realized, that over time that maybe similarity is a good thing as well to an extent, because then they're matching the way the citizens are communicating. So that's number one. Number two, when you do drill down, which Vivo really helps us to do, you can come up with things like this. And I call this our floral arrangement graphic, because it looks like you're looking down into an arrangement of roses or some kind of flowers. And each one represents a sunburst around a different narrative, different prominent narrative. So when we looked at the top 7 narratives in terms of frequency. Keep in mind this is in terms of frequency. So does frequency, correlate to meaning? Not necessarily, but it's where we're looking first. Let's put it that way. You see some real similarity. Like for instance, beauty and grandeur. You see that over there. From the citizen side, you see it on the visual or the NPS side. Recreation, about the same on both sides. History, about the same. A notion of sharing, a notion of discussing how Find Your Park is rewarding, about the same. Everything kind of similar. But where it really, you see some differences, which are interesting to us, is that beauty and grandeur on the citizen side, as far as the narrative, is much more prominent than it is on the National Park Service side. And so for someone like Sarah, would you find that interesting? Do you need to do more presentation of just look how beautiful all this is, or do you want to do it, or do you not want to do it? Also, we're seeing differences in terms of photography and creativity. There's really no presence at all on the NPS side, but there's quite a bit on the citizen side. Also, this notion of connection and reflection, right up here, we're seeing a bit of that on the citizen side, but not really at all on the National Park Service side. What's also interesting is how they're similar in what's not there. And one thing we did notice is that there's not a great deal of diversity in the narratives, and on both sides. There were like 4 examples, I think, of posts that you would call diverse, pushing a diverse narrative on the NPS side, only 2 on the side. So if NPS would increase the amount of posting they do on diversity, would the citizens then follow? So I think I'm going to turn this over to Emily here for a moment. This stuff, we're kind of early on combining Facebook and Instagram, but now what we're going to be doing is kind of drilling down into the individual types. And in this case, we're going to be looking at Instagram.
So now I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper that I recently wrote for a conference where I'm looking at identity presentation on Instagram through the Find Your Park campaign. So in some of the social media literature that we've referenced, they're just talking about social media as an environment where individuals can interact, they can exchange and create meaning, and so by posting a photo and describing it, possibly hashtagging it, a user might communicate that they're a really avid traveler and they're, an outdoorsman or an outdoors woman, they're adventurous, so whatever type of identity or identities they want to put forward, they can do that through their image and the associated text and essentially create a stream of the self. So I wanted to show an example of an Instagram post, and this corresponds with this theme that kind of emerged through this paper called Citizen Identity Multiplicity. And so one of the findings that I came across in this paper was citizens, as compared to the National Park Service, are much more dynamic and multifaceted in the way that they present their identities. The National Park Service is a little more restricted or limited in terms of the types of things. So chances are, if you were comparing this type of post to something with the National Park Service, the Park Service wouldn't have as many hashtags. Their description might be very, very short, not quite as much of an identity presentation. This example, the woman, her name itself is, her username is A Girl Travels. And so she's talking about her experience at Zion National Park, and then she hashtags a lot of different things, which we coded for a traveler identity, an adventurous identity, an outdoors woman, someone who, you know, is an active fitness person. She hashtags hiking and hiking adventures. So we created different codes essentially for all of these hashtags, and what this says to me is that, you know, she's presenting different identities through this post. And she also hashtags Black adventuristas, so she's identifying her race as well. So that was one finding from the paper. A second finding is that citizens, as compared to the NPS, more frequently present multiple feelings associated with their posts. So they're often communicating emotions related to their experience in a national park. So this is another citizen example, and the person is at Bandelier National Park in New Mexico. And they've got hashtags talking about opt outside, outdoor life, camp vibes, venture out. So this idea that, you know, the outdoors, respecting the outdoors, those are things that are really important to this person. And so we have, you know, many examples where feelings are presented as something that's of importance to people experiencing national parks, at least on the citizen side. And then finding 3, the National Park Service is more likely to present images of celebrities or public figures and or park rangers in their posts. And so these 2 images are of Terrence J., who is a Find Your Park ambassador for the campaign. So he's, you know, holding up the Find Your Park sign, posing with the park ranger. And so we're seeing that the National Park Service is interested in, you know, presenting itself with public figures to kind of showcase the support that they might be receiving from them, you know, generate a little bit more publicity through that possibly. And then finally, a 4th finding, which is not all that surprising, I guess, considering the focus of this project, is that there's a major celebration of the outdoors in national parks, and that's an idea that was, you know, very emergent through this process. The reason being is because we collected our sample using hashtag Find Your Park and coded that for a celebration of, you know, parks or the outdoors. So it's not really that surprising considering all of our posts contain that. Okay, so this is Joe.
You know, details are fun, but how does it relate to theory? And that the kind of approach that we have on the constructivist kind of interpretivist side, we don't really follow the scientific method in that way. We don't sort of go in with, we try to be as open as possible, although we always have assumptions, we know that. But we go and we go out and find theory that fits, we question and or support it based on what we've been doing. And so these are some of the theoretical areas we've been drawing from, that's some real recent theory, everything from the late 2000s at least. Social media, we're finding, is a productive source of representation. I think we're establishing that. Social media can be a strategic communication strategy. I guess I used strategy twice there. But it can be strategic in trying to get messaging across. There's a lot out there in our area, and this seems to support that. Also, this notion of social media as translocality. And what that means is that you know, we oftentimes think of experience in sort of direct nature, and then we think of experience in virtual reality. But what we're finding is that social media presents sort of a middle space where you need to kind of have experience with both sides to pull the 2 together. And this is a new form of human experience. And so our research supports that and is supported by that theory as well. But also, this is kind of, believe it or not, kind of radical coming from a constructivist or an interpretivist, discursive kind of scholar. Social media as part of a nature pattern network. And this really comes out of actor network theory. And we're pulling in some interesting theory that kind of gets us back to the idea that does nature participate in meaning? I was raised the last 30 years, and some of you may find this surprising because you may not have been raised this way. It says that all meaning is a result of human activity. It's what's going on in our heads. It's what's going on in our society. I'm starting to feel from the research that I'm doing that sometimes butterflies, sometimes mountains, sometimes trees, we have to recognize that they participate in meaning. They don't make meaning. This is kind of a subtle difference. But they participate in the ways they are presented in these media forms. So that's kind of the directions that we're taking, right, in our research, and this is being supported by that. And Emily, here you can finish up with the overview.
So the last piece that we just wanted to talk about is where we're heading for phase 2, which we're really just starting to work on that now. But we're going to include some new platforms as units of analysis. So we'll look at Twitter and collect 60 citizen posts and 60 NPS posts, just like we did with the other two. And then also look at YouTube, specifically the Find Your Park channel on YouTube that the National Park Service has. And they have 12 videos posted there right now, so we'll analyze those 12 videos. And then 12 citizen videos, which we'll collect using the hashtag #FindYourPark as our sample generator. We'll look at Twitter using the same method that we used in phase 1, selecting every 5th post. Our rationale for doing that is because there's such a vast amount of information that we're just going to take a small sample from what's there, capturing 20 images over the course of a 3-week period. And then with YouTube, NVivo has some different software capabilities that allow you to analyze videos within NVivo, so we'll use that and also employ constant comparison to do some more of that granular in-depth coding, and then also do some analysis of comments on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook from those 60 samples, those 60 images that we've sampled. So that's kind of an overview of where we're heading. And that's all we had to cover. So are there any questions?